Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. We take a deep dive into the stories that have captivated our imaginations. And today, we're unraveling one that sent shivers down spines for decades. The Amityville Horror. You've sent us a stack of material on this case. Newspaper clippings, book excerpts, even some paranormal investigator reports. But is it just a ghost story, or is there something more to uncover?
What's fascinating here is that this story sits at the intersection of true crime and the paranormal. It all starts with a real family and a real house. And that's where the horror truly begins.
Right, it's not just some fictional haunted house tale. We're talking about 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. And the story starts with a tragedy. The DeFeo family murders on November 13, 1974. Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his parents and 4 siblings in their beds. It's a horrific crime that casts a long shadow over everything that follows.
Absolutely. And the fact that DeFeo was only 23 years old at the time adds another layer of unsettling mystery to the case. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, ultimately dying in prison in 2021.
So you had this house where this unimaginable tragedy occurred. And just over a year later, in December 1975, the Lutz family moves in, George and Kathy Lutz, along with Kathy's 3 children. You think people would be hesitant to buy that house?
Yeah,
Would think.
wouldn't you? But they got it for a remarkably low price, $80,000, even for 1975. That seems incredibly cheap for a 5-bedroom Dutch colonial with a gambrel roof, a swimming pool, a boathouse, and situated right on a canal. It makes you wonder if the price reflected the home's dark history.
Maybe the previous owners were just desperate to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me. The Lutzes moved in. And according to their account, much of the DeFeo family's furniture was still there. Can you imagine sleeping in a bed where someone was murdered? Or eating at a table where a family was brutally taken from this world?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That detail alone would be enough to make most people uneasy. But the Lutz's story goes far beyond just unsettling furniture. Before they even moved in, a friend insisted on having the house blessed.
That seems reasonable considering the circumstances.
Yeah.
So they called in a Catholic priest, Father Ray, to perform the blessing. This is where we start to see the first hints of the paranormal emerging.
You're right, exactly. As Father Ray began the blessing, he claimed to hear a masculine voice telling him to get out. He also felt an unseen force slapping him and experienced intense cold spots despite it being a mild winter day. What's particularly striking is that he initially chose not to share these experiences with the Lutzes.
Wow. That's a pretty big detail to omit, especially given the house's history.
Yeah.
Do you think he kept that to himself?
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe he didn't want to frighten them before they even had a chance to settle in. Or perhaps he was questioning his own sanity, trying to rationalize what he experienced.
I can understand that. I mean, if I heard a voice telling me to get out of a house where a family had been murdered, I'd probably second-guess myself too. But then things start to escalate for the Lutzes.
Right. Yes. Their first few weeks in the house were relatively uneventful. They described it as feeling like they were each living in a different house, almost like they were in their own separate bubbles. But by mid-January 1976, things took a dramatic turn. Remember that second-floor room where Father Ray felt the strongest negative presence?
Right. The one he was warned about by the unseen voice.
Well, that's the room Kathy Lutz had chosen as her sewing room. Shortly after they moved in, Father Ray called George to again warn him about that specific room, but before he could explain further, the phone call was abruptly cut off by unexplained static.
Okay. Now that would creep me out. A mysterious voice telling you to get out. Then a warning about a specific room, followed by a phone call abruptly cut off by static. It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
And this is where it gets even stranger. After the phone call, Father Ray developed a high fever and blisters on his hands. The blisters were so severe that they resembled stigmata, the wounds of Christ.
Wow. That's a pretty significant detail. It suggests a possible link between Father Ray's experience in the house and the events that were unfolding for the Lutzes. And things continued to escalate from there, right?
They did, culminating in a terrifying final night at 112 Ocean Avenue that forced the Lutzes to flee.
Okay, now I have to know what happened on that final night. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this deep dive and other captivating stories on Tell Me More.
That's the thing. The Lutzes have always refused to share the full details of that night, saying that it was simply too terrifying to recount.
That's chilling. Whatever happened must have been truly horrifying if they won't talk about it after all these years.
From what little they have revealed, we know that they made the decision to flee to Kathy's mother's house, taking only some of their belongings with them.
So they just left everything behind. They didn't even try to go back for anything else.
Apparently not. And there's one particularly disturbing detail. They claimed that as they were leaving 112 Ocean Avenue, a greenish-black slime was pursuing them. That's right. They left almost everything behind. They said it felt like something was chasing them out of the house.
That image of the greenish-black slime is just so unsettling. But if something was so intent on driving them out, why didn't it follow them to Kathy's mother's house?
That's a question that has fueled a lot of debate. Some paranormal investigators have theorized that whatever entity was present in the house was tied to the location itself, not to the Lutzes specifically.
So it was like a haunting that was specific to 112 Ocean Avenue, almost like the evil was embedded in the very structure of the house.
That's one interpretation. But of course, not everyone believes the Lutz's account. In fact, the Amityville Horror story has been one of the most scrutinized and debated paranormal cases in history.
It's easy to see why it's captured so much attention. It has all the elements of a classic ghost story, a tragic backstory, a seemingly innocent family, and a series of increasingly disturbing events. But you mentioned skepticism. And I know that there are a lot of people who believe the whole thing was a hoax.
Absolutely. There are several inconsistencies and contradictions in the Lutz's story that have raised red flags for researchers and skeptics alike. For example, remember Father Ray, the priest who blessed the house and experienced those disturbing phenomena.
Yes, the one who heard the voice and developed these stigmata-like blisters.
Well, his account has been challenged over the years. He's given conflicting statements about the extent of his involvement with the Lutzes and the events at the house. Some reports suggest he never actually went inside the house, while others claim he only visited once and never experienced any paranormal activity.
So there's some question about whether his experiences were as dramatic as they were initially portrayed. That's a pretty significant detail to be disputed. What about the Lutzes themselves? Have their claims been directly challenged?
Yes, and not just by skeptics, but by people who lived in the house after them, the Cromartie family, who purchased 112 Ocean Avenue in 1977, have stated publicly that they never experienced anything unusual while living there. They even disputed claims of property damage that the Lutzes described, saying that the doors, locks, and windows all appeared to be original and in good condition.
So if the Cromarties didn't experience any of the paranormal activity that the Lutzes described,
Yeah.
and if there's no evidence of the property damage that the Lutzes claimed, then what are we left with?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are other disputed claims as well. Remember those chilling cloven hoof prints in the snow that supposedly appeared outside the house? Well, researchers who investigated weather records from that time period found that there wasn't any snowfall in Amityville during the time the Lutzes lived there.
That seems like a pretty substantial detail to get wrong, especially if you're trying to convince people that your story is true. What about the neighbors? Did anyone else report seeing or hearing anything strange while the Lutzes were living at 112 Ocean Avenue?
That's another point of contention. None of the Lutz's neighbors ever reported seeing or hearing anything unusual during the 28 days the Lutz family lived there. And while the book and the 1979 movie depict police visiting the house, there are no official records of the Lutzes ever calling the police.
So no corroborating evidence from official sources or from people who lived in the immediate vicinity. It seems like the Lutz's story is starting to unravel a bit.
It does, doesn't it? But perhaps the most damning claim came from an unexpected source. William Weber, the defense lawyer for Ronald DeFeo Jr.
Wait, the lawyer who represented the man who murdered his entire family, what did he have to say about the Amityville Horror?
Weber publicly stated that he and the Lutzes had fabricated the story over many bottles of wine. He claimed that they were all hoping to capitalize on the DeFeo murders with a sensationalized book deal.
So are we saying the Lutzes made the whole thing up?
It's not quite that simple. George Lutz maintained until his death in 2006 that the events described in the Amityville Horror were mostly true. He claimed that they didn't invent the story, but they might have embellished certain details.
Mostly true. That phrase leaves a lot of room for interpretation, doesn't it? It's interesting that he chose to hold on to that claim even when faced with so much contradictory evidence.
It is. The Lutzes even went so far as to take polygraph tests in 1979 to try to prove they were telling the truth.
What were the results? Did they pass?
The results were inconclusive, and even if they had passed, polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable. They're not admissible as evidence in court for a reason.
Right. They can be influenced by a variety of factors, including anxiety, nervousness, and even the skill of the examiner.
Yeah.
So we're left with a story that has captivated millions, but is riddled with holes and inconsistencies. It's almost as if the truth of the Amityville Horror is as elusive as the ghosts it claims to depict.
That's a great way to put it. Despite all the skepticism and debunking, The story continues to hold a strange power over our imaginations. Maybe it's the inherent creepiness of the house itself, or the fact that it started with a real-life tragedy.
Or maybe it's because we all crave a good ghost story. We want to believe that there are things beyond our understanding, things that go bump in the night.
There's definitely something compelling about the idea that there are forces at play in the universe that we can't fully comprehend. And the Amityville Horror, with all its ambiguity and unsettling details, taps into that primal fear of the unknown.
It's a story that has been told and retold, adapted into movies, books, and countless documentaries. And even though we might question its validity, there's no denying that it's left an indelible mark on our collective consciousness.
But there's another layer to the story that we haven't even touched on yet. The Amityville Horror didn't just spawn a cultural phenomenon. It also drew the attention of some of the most famous paranormal investigators in the world.
You're talking about Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Right.
Right, the demonologists who were featured in the Conjuring movies. Did they actually investigate the Amityville house?
They did, back in 1976, just a few months after the Lutzes fled. And what they claim to have found there adds a whole new dimension to the story.
The Warrens investigating the Amityville house. That's wild. I mean, they're practically legends in the paranormal world. What did they make of the whole thing?
Well, they went in with their usual methods, interviews, psychical readings, and even some photographic experiments. And what's interesting is that they concluded that the house was indeed haunted, and not just by any ordinary spirits.
Let me guess. They found evidence of demonic activity.
That's right. They believed that the house was infested with malevolent entities that were drawn to the site because of the horrific murders that took place there. They even claimed to have captured a chilling photograph.
Oh, what kind of photograph?
It was an infrared photo that seemingly depicts a young boy with glowing eyes standing at the foot of the stairs. It's been dubbed the demonic boy photograph, and it's become one of the most iconic images associated with the Amityville case.
Okay, I've got chills.
Yeah.
I've seen enough paranormal documentaries to know that glowing eyes are rarely a good sign. Did the Warrens elaborate on what they thought this demonic boy was?
They believed it was the spirit of one of the DeFeo children, twisted and corrupted by the demonic presence in the house. The Warrens believed that the demonic forces were using the children's spirits as pawns in their efforts to torment and terrorize the living.
That's a horrifying thought. The idea of these innocent children being manipulated by evil forces even after death. The Warrens weren't the only paranormal investigators who were drawn to the Amityville house, were they?
No, you're right. Another well-known paranormal investigator, Hans Holzer, also investigated 112 Ocean Avenue. He conducted seances and claimed to have made contact with several entities, including a Native American spirit who told him that the land the house was built on was cursed.
So you have these multiple accounts from priests, paranormal investigators, and the Lutzes themselves, all claiming that there was something sinister happening at 112 Ocean Avenue. It makes you wonder if there's some truth to the story, even if some of the details have been embellished or misremembered.
It's certainly a possibility. And what's particularly interesting is that the Amityville horror story didn't just fade away after the initial frenzy died down. It continued to capture the public's imagination, spawning countless books, movies, and documentaries.
And it even found its way into the Conjuring universe.
Right, exactly. The Warrens' investigation of the Amityville house was depicted in The Conjuring 2, bringing the story to a whole new generation of horror fans.
It's fascinating how this one case, with all its contradictions and unanswered questions, has become such a pervasive part of our cultural landscape. What do you think it is about the Amityville horror that continues to fascinate us, even after all these years?
I think it speaks to our primal fears, our innate anxieties about the unknown. It also raises questions about the nature of belief, the power of suggestion, and the way we process trauma and grief.
We're all drawn to stories of the supernatural, tales of things that go bump in the night. But the Amityville horror is more than just a ghost story. It's a story about a real family who experienced something that terrified them to their core, something that forced them to flee their home and leave everything behind.
And whether you believe their account or not, there's no denying the psychological impact that those events had on them. The Amityville horror might not have definitive answers, but it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that there are things in this world that we may never fully understand.
And perhaps that's the most terrifying aspect of the whole story, the idea that there are forces at play beyond our comprehension, lurking just beyond the veil of our everyday reality.
The Amityville horror is a reminder that the line between the known and the unknown is often blurry and uncertain. And sometimes, The most unsettling stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
It's a story that invites us to consider the limits of our own perception and the possibility that there are things in this universe that defy rational explanation. And as we wrap up our deep dives into the Amityville Horror, I think the biggest takeaway is that the truth, like a ghost, is often elusive and enigmatic.
It's up to each of us to examine the evidence, weigh the possibilities, and come to our own conclusions. And who knows, maybe someday. The true story of what happened at 112 Ocean Avenue will finally be revealed. Until then, the mystery endures.
Thanks for joining us on Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast, where we explore the strange, the unsettling, and the unexplained. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll delve into another captivating tale that's sure to keep you on the edge of your seat.